Hi, everyone. I'm just going to give it another minute for everyone to be able to join us. And then we're going to start 7:01, just to give everyone a chance to log in. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Rochelle, and I'm part of the EdCo team. Welcome to Touchstones webinar. This webinar is going to be recorded, so you'll have a copy of it for you to watch later on, or also if you want to share it with your colleagues. This webinar is going to be hosted by Claire. So Claire Madden is an English and history teacher based in Cork. She is a former JCT English associate, and she delivers English teaching webinars on behalf of education centers nationwide. So before I hand over to Claire, just to let you know that we have a Q&A session at the very end of it. So feel free to pop in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll answer them either through chat or live later on. And also to let you know that we will give you a certificate of attendance as well. So I'll pop in the email where you can request the certificate of attendance later on. All right, thanks, Claire.
Okay, hello everybody and welcome to tonight's webinar. Thank you so much for joining me tonight to talk about first year English. So I'm going to talk about a few things tonight. I'm going to start with a little bit on planning first year English and specifically on planning fiction and poetry. Then I'm going to move on to talk about kind of, I suppose, literacy issues that I think are becoming more and more the reality of our classrooms and look at some data and a project that I've been working on with that. And then I'm going to look at some practical solutions to kind of help us teach fiction and poetry to very, very mixed ability classes. So planning to start. So we all know at this stage for first year planning, you need to know the requirements, I suppose, of the curriculum. There's 22 learning outcomes and, there's specific text requirements. So you have to study at least a novel. You need to look at a variety of literary, non-literary texts, short stories, and at least 10 poems. It doesn't specify the depth in which you need to go into any of these texts, so you can treat each one of the texts, I suppose, in different depth if you like. So, for example, you might choose one specific poem you want to do as a studied poem and do it in great depth, and another poem you just want to maybe read one day in class. So I think I've always approached it where, if you try and plan your year in learning outcomes, you'll find it really, really, really difficult. So the learning outcomes kind of, I suppose, once you come to terms with them, they really are just the nuts and bolts of teaching English. So my suggestion is kind of to start your planning or to start thinking about planning, just use the genres, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, and film. So I start off by looking at the 5 terms and I count the weeks in each term. The long first term, I think, kind of suits fiction or poetry, as they're always kind of the longest units to get through. Whereas if you have a shorter term, a 5 week term somewhere, I think kind of film or something like that is always a good one to put in there. So next thing I'll do is I will look at my school's exam and reporting calendar. So you know kind of what assessments you're working towards. Then I'd think about the texts that I want to teach. And I try to be really realistic about what I'll actually get covered in that time. And then I'll think about the resources that I have or the resources that I'm going to use to teach that section. And obviously, in my case here, I'm using my book and I've highlighted in my plan here the sections I'll use. Finally, then, in my case, I'll look at kind of planning out the homework. So I don't do kind of homework every night. I use the projects in the book as homework assignments. They're kind of longer pieces of work that they do over a kind of a longer period of time. And I suppose there's less chance of an AI robot doing it than the child. And it gets them kind of used to working to a deadline, managing a project. And most of them are kind of, I suppose, more creative and fun projects. So they're a bit more motivated to do them. So I think this kind of simple overview planning sheet for the year is really, really helpful. It's really, really basic, but it's really clear. So for first year fiction specifically, I think about what I would love my students to be leaving my class in first year with. So what knowledge do I want them to have and what skills do I want them to start developing? So in terms of key fiction kind of terminology or literacy, I want them to know and to understand what a plot is, character, setting, and the different types of narrative perspectives. I want them to read multiple short stories and I want them to read at least two novels, but I usually do get about three of them done. In terms of skills, then, I try and think kind of long term. So I want them to be able to pick up a poem, to pick up a novel, a play, a film, and be able eventually to, analyze it themselves. But that kind of a task, it actually contains a lot of skills and skills that I would like to start teaching and embedding in first year. So specifically with fiction, I want them to develop kind of writing skills, specifically to be able to write a good character and a good setting and not write a really, really long essay all about plot. And I also want them to develop their learning skills. So things like being able to create a text plot organizer, creating a text character map, or making flashcards for their key quotes for their texts. And for first year poetry, then I try to think about what do I really want them moving on to second year with. So again, we're thinking long term here. So how are you going to kind of lay the foundations in first year so that by the time they get to study a full poet in Leaving Cert, that they have that kind of skill set. So I would love for them to, I suppose, know and understand all of the usual key poetry terms, simile, metaphor, personification, by the time they're leaving my class. I would absolutely love if one day in my life I was sitting in teaching one of my Leaving Cert classes and I didn't get asked by somebody what a simile was. It would just be amazing if all of that groundwork could be done and dusted in first year and, at the very least by the end of third year. And I know, look, that's wishful thinking, but we have to have hopes and dreams. So on top of that, then I want to kind of expose them to lots and lots and lots of poems, short poems, long poems, extracts from poems, lines from poems. And on top of that, I'll try and do four, I call them studied poems in depth. So I'll try to teach poetry analysis and poetry study skills through those four studied poems. So, in terms of analysis skills, what I mean there is the ability to pick up a poem and annotate it, the ability to make basic inferences, the ability to pick out a quotation, embed a quotation into a piece of writing. And I think if you can get those building blocks in place in first year, you can kind of springboard on then to kind of more formal analytical writing when you get into second year. And in terms of study skills, then I really want to set up students to be able to learn quotes using flashcards and also to organize their poetry notes into graphic organizers or into sketch notes. So once you kind of have your overview done and you're kind of really clear then on your specific your aims, I suppose, for your specific different genres, you can drill down then into kind of what you want to achieve in each of the texts that you've kind of chosen. So you then is kind of when you bring in the learning outcomes. So certain learning outcomes will suit certain texts and certain learning outcomes will suit certain genres. So ones that, are very clear they work for poetry and ones that are very clear they work for fiction and other ones then it's very clearly oral communication stuff that you're doing. So I suppose if you feel like this is, a part of the planning you don't want to do, I have done all of this first year planning in the units in the book. So you could just save yourself a lot of time and hassle and you could just use them if you like. I've broken it down into what I think is kind of a manageable way of looking at units. So I've taken each text and I've said, right, these are the type of activities that are available in the book to do on these texts, and these are the learning outcomes that correspond to those activities. So it should be quite kind of clear in the planning that I've done. Okay, so that's kind of the brief run through of the planning section, and I'm going to get on to now talk about mixed level or mixability teaching in English. So my question there is, is it getting harder to teach mixed ability or mixed level English classes? And my answer personally is, I think that it definitely is. So I've been involved in a project for the last 3 years in my school or I've basically been looking for solutions to this problem. Personally, I was finding it like increasingly harder and harder, I suppose, to meet all of the needs of all of the students in my class because the gap between, my students who were struggling the most and the students that were not struggling at all and they were, dying to get on with the much harder stuff, it would just seem to be getting like wider and wider every year. So I'll give you kind of like an example there. My junior cycle English class from last summer, I had 16 ordinary level and 12 higher level in that class. And I had a huge range of reading ages within that one class. And I'm really thankful that in my school, that's the last time I'm going to have to do whatever magic I did to get all of those kids across the line. That's the last time we're going to be teaching in that way in my school. So I'm going to, before I go into what we're doing now in my school, I'm going to take a closer look at kind of what the problem looks like in practice in a classroom. So this is what a 10-year gap in literacy levels actually looks like in a classroom. So if you take a look there at text number 1, so that's for, a kid with a reading age of 8. Okay. And if you look at text number 4, that's a kid with a reading age of 17, and then the other two in between. So keep that in mind there. And this is kind of the reality. If you went into a classroom and you put a text in front of students that had a reading age of 8, 9, 10, 11, and you asked them to read this text, this is kind of what it looks like to them. And that's a really tough space to be in, especially when these are the types of texts that you're probably coming across day after day after day if you are struggling with literacy. So I suppose for us as teachers in the classroom, the question really becomes like, how do you teach both of these students simultaneously at the same time in the one classroom? Because that like I feel like that's been the actual reality of my classroom more and more recently, but definitely over the last 10 years. So I'm just going to show you there how the issue kind of presents with the whole cohort of students. So this is 194 students. So this is this year's first years. So we use the NGRT reading test in the first term of first year to assess where all of our students are with their reading. You can see here across the year group, there's 40 exceptional readers. They should be able to read anything you put in front of them, which is amazing. And we have another 60 kids there who are at their reading age or above. And, that's brilliant as well. But then we have about 48 kids, who are a small bit behind where they should be, and they do need help bridging that gap. And then you have major concern with the 26 kids reading below the age of 10, and then the other 13 reading below the age of 9. And they're of major concern, not only like they're not just going to struggle in English, they're also going to struggle in history, in geography, in science, and in maths. Their day at school must be really, really difficult. So what I did is I did a lot of kind of reading and research around what would a successful reading intervention look like. And I suppose the summary version is that I needed to provide lots and lots and lots and lots of access to lots and lots and lots of reading for these kids at a level that these kids could access. And that the activities around the reading needed to reinforce comprehension without overwhelming their working memory. So what I did is I looked at our English course and the text that we were teaching in my school. And I started making these literacy boost versions of all of our key texts. So what I was doing is I was kind of simplifying the texts themselves. And then I was making a set of more manageable and more kind of scaffolded tasks as close to the original tasks that everyone else was doing as possible. So not a job I'd recommend to a friend. There was a huge amount of work in it, but I kind of felt like it was the only way I was going to be able to balance both in my classroom and I suppose, yeah, be successful in it. So I think there's kind of two ways that you could use this type of a program, and we're using both currently in my school. So in first year, all of the classes are mixed ability, and I use the Literacy Boost program alongside the main textbook program. And in second and third year, then we use the Literacy Boost program, but what we've done is we've created additional class groups. We call them the Literacy Boost classes. So these classes, the students are selected based on their reading age, their English STEM, their CAT scores, and like how they do in their English assessments. And basically, we identify the 30 kids most in need. And when English is on across the line in the year group, we've basically put on an extra class, and we've put two teachers into that class, a lead teacher and a support teacher. And we've also put an SNA in there. Okay. And we've taken that from our learning support time. So this is data, I suppose, in some of the classes that we put together. I've obviously taken out the names of the students. You can see like a lot of the students have a lot of additional needs, and they're all clearly really struggling with reading. So they needed really targeted, really consistent support. And what we did is we put in our most experienced teachers into those classes. And we used, like I said, we used the learning support hours to put them in. So some of the kids completely blossomed in the smaller class. I mean, after doing this project, I have so many thoughts about ridiculous class sizes in Ireland and, how amazing it would be if we could kind of cut that down a bit. But look, it's a rant for another day. But just so many kids fall between the cracks because, we're trying to teach 30 students all at once. It's just too many to get around to. So the resources were all tailored to them. There was always a teacher or an SNA kind of near to help them, to get them started, to write the first word, to write the first sentence. And what they really, really liked is there was always someone there to read their work and to give them kind of live feedback and kind of encouragement. And like, if I was to simplify it down, like every day we did a little bit of talking, a little bit of thinking, a piece of reading, and a piece of writing. And it was simple, but it was effective. So like I said, thinking, talking, reading, writing, repeat. And they got used to kind of the routine of the class and they got used to the types of questions and the types of tasks and the type of scaffolds that we were repeating. And I suppose those are the types of tasks and the types of questions, I suppose, that typically turn up in the junior cert ordinary level exam. So they were quite prepped for that when their pre's came around. So we retested then the whole group at the end of the year. And this is from last year's cohort, and almost all of them kind of made an improvement. And look, I suppose when you're looking at data, there's always a story behind every piece of data. And it was really interesting to see how some kids thrived in the group. Some of them made huge jumps. Some of the EAL students, they were really, really bright, but they just needed a kind of a boost with their language skills. And then they kind of like they took off. Some of the kids were really struggling with kind of sensory overload in the classroom and they just couldn't cope. They couldn't regulate themselves. And in a kind of smaller, calmer environment, they absolutely flew ahead. Some of them improved, I suppose, to a level that like they can now access the curriculum, not just in English, but in history and geography and science and all their subjects. Um, and look, I don't want to completely sugarcoat it either as a project. You're dealing with really difficult kids at times. And look, not everyone made progress. There were, some kids who didn't attend school regularly. If they're not in, they can't learn. And students who struggled really badly, with behavior issues, and we did have two kids who were recommended to go into the class, and their parents didn't want them to go in. So that's kind of the reality of it, the truth of it as well. But I suppose it's a good news story. The vast majority of them did make progress, and like I said, we're able to access the curriculum afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to try now and apply that project to teaching first year fiction and to teaching first year poetry. Okay, so I'm going to go with fiction first. So again, it's really, really simple. Reading, writing, bit of talking, bit of thinking. So what I did is I sourced some really good short stories. So those are stories that like you're going to get done in a 40-minute class or an hour-long class. They're really accessible stories. They're really fun. Um, they're really engaging, and students really kind of like the idea of getting a full story read in a class, and there's kind of a satisfaction in that. So for all of those short story extracts, what I've done is in the main textbook version, I have the main story, and I have a simplified Literacy Boost version then in the Literacy Boost workbook. And you could kind of approach this in two ways in your class, and I've done both. So you could do it where everyone reads the main version first, and then everyone reads the Literacy Boost version as a summary. Or you could do it the other way around. Or I have some kids who just, they know they struggle with reading and they just want to read the easier version. They have no interest in, trying to do the other one at all. So in the program, you've got, the text itself differentiated, but I also have differentiated a lot of the tasks as well. So in the book, the normal tasks, the more mainstream tasks appear at the end of each, the Literacy Boost tasks appear at the end of each chapter in the activity book. So it's not a separate book. It's quite subtle in the classroom. So basically what I've kind of tried to achieve here is working on the same text, but at different levels. And you can kind of see that that's an example from one of the novels I've used in this book, Private Peaceful, where some kids are working on quote questing through the chapter where they're trying to find a suitable quote that sums up the chapter, whereas the Literacy Boost kids are looking at the quote and they're trying to remember the character that has said that quote. So I'm going to kind of presume here that given that this is an audience of English teachers, that we're all good readers. I could sit down with a book for hours. It comes easily to me. But I suppose we have to try and remember that like it's not like that for everyone. And sometimes it's really easy to forget that. So both of my own kids really struggled with reading. They're both dyslexic. So I got a lot of really good, very bluntly honest data from them on why they struggle with reading comprehension tasks in school and why they dislike them, I suppose. So they talked to me about like how tiring reading is for them, even though they both love stories and they'd sit down for hours if you read to them. But their brains are tired after doing the reading. So having to then go on and do the hard reading task with the reams and reams of writing was like really difficult for them. So I thought about making the tasks that were connected to the reading really manageable and really just doable. Not huge mountains of writing. Their brains are already frazzled from the reading, you know, something so that they don't want to just quit or they don't get really overwhelmed with it. So tasks kind of like the multiple choice tasks, matching tasks, filling in the blanks, adding a detail, who said what, adding sentence starters. So I'm going to go through a few examples of those there now. And I've taken them all from the Private Peaceful studied novel, Literacy Boost section. So you've got your multiple choice questions, and I know these questions get a bad rep and people are wondering why, multiple choice questions are on exam papers and all of that. But what they kind of do is they provide a plot recap for students, which is really useful for students who struggle with processing what they've just read and comprehending it. They're low stakes, they're an easy activity, the brain doesn't have to focus on writing, so it frees up space in their working memory to kind of take in and process the plot. You have things then like fill in the blanks. Again, this is a plot recap. They're reading proper sentences and they're looking at sentence structure by doing this activity. Then you've got something like this, we all know what it's like to get up these really short, blunt sentences from kids, and you're trying to tell them you need to expand that, you need to, how to make this a better sentence. And this activity, add a detail. You're given the simple sentence and they have to make it better by adding a detail that they know about the text. So that's kind of what the main things that I was doing with the writing texts, the reading texts, and this is more kind of about the writing activities. So like a piece of writing can be completely overwhelming for a lot of the students that I teach. And over the last few years, I've kind of looked at what writing supports helps the most to get them writing. And this kind of has become my go-to list. So you've got to start with reading a text. Um, it's a huge scaffold to the writing task itself. It gives them ideas because a lot of them will struggle with ideation in general. So this is kind of the literacy boost scaffolding. So they need word banks to try and expand their vocabulary. And like I said, ideation's often it's a real blocker for these kids. So giving them suggestions of what they could write about saves them sitting there and kind of just staring at the page for 20 minutes, not knowing what to write. Um, and they also find it hard to kind of think through the sentence before writing it. So giving them a sentence starter also kind of really helps them to get going. And another example here from a different writing task, word banks again, paragraph ideas, sentence starters. And another thing as well that I really found that the students were struggling with was remembering that they also had to pay attention to the fact that the question was also asking them to write in a very specific text structure. So the ones there on the screen, they're postcards they're supposed to be writing. So to prevent the cognitive overload they'd feel with that, I give them the text structure to write into, and that really helped as well. So that's kind of my run through on how I've approached the mixed ability teaching in first year fiction, and specifically what I do with the literacy boost kids and that. So I'm going to move on now to teaching poetry to mixed ability, which I think is much harder. Um, so when I get kids in first year, I ask them what they know about poetry, and the first years generally tell me, they know one or two poems off by heart. They've been made learn, I suppose, in primary school. They tend to know maybe one or two Irish poems off by heart. And then I kind of start asking, do they know any songs? Do they know any riddles, any nursery rhymes? And they kind of tend to be able to recall them, but I think it's probably the first time someone's connecting them to this is poetry as well. Um, so basically, I say that their poetry schema or their poetry brain is quite limited and unconnected in first year. And if I want them to be able to answer, a full John Montague question in sixth year, I've got to work on, actively building up their poetry brain or their poetry schema, connecting their schema, assisting them in being able to retrieve stuff, and to be able to retrieve it automatically, I suppose, in an exam situation. I suppose in short, really, like they know way less about poetry than they know about fiction. So that's an additional barrier to students who struggle with reading. They struggle a lot more with reading poetry. So with the knowledge of kind of where I know my first year students are usually coming in with, I then can kind of plan for where I want them to be by the end of the year. Um, and I've kind of gone through there what my aims are for first year poetry. So one of the key things I suppose with teaching poetry is we need to teach them poetic techniques. There's a language question, effectiveness of language question on, every year on junior cycle English. And look, we know how important it is in leaving cert English. But I think this needs to be kind of a realistic step by step process. You can see the steps of the stairs kind of image I've put on the screen there. If a student's kind of not solid in understanding what a metaphor is, they're not going to be able to pick it out. They're not going to be able to kind of infer what it means. And they're certainly not going to be able to say why they thought it was an effective use of metaphor in this poem. And when they get to leaving cert, then they're definitely not going to be able to say how effectively the poet uses metaphor throughout their work. So it's like steps of the stairs, and you got to get kind of step one solid in first year, in my opinion. So I basically have a core group of techniques that I want to do in first year. I add on a few more in second year and a few more in third year. Yours probably looks different to mine, but I think it's good to plan it out. And I think by adding them incrementally, you're kind of managing the cognitive load on the kids as well. So I think one of the most important stages of teaching poetic techniques is the stage where the teacher is explaining them. So I used to do it by giving a definition and getting the students to learn off the definition many, many years ago. But, and some of my students were able to memorize that definition and repeat it back to me. But, as I went on then with the poetry course, I wanted them to identify the techniques and comment on them. And it was clear that they only knew the definition in a kind of a rote learned way. They didn't actually understand it. So now I kind of approach it like this, all with the aim of kind of building this strong kind of foundation in poetry. So you got to start by giving them a clear explanation of what the technique is. Maybe tell them where the word comes from, the etymology of the word, and then you need to give multiple concrete examples. And like I have examples there from the pages in my book, but maybe six isn't enough. Maybe you got to keep going. Maybe you got to give them 20 examples before finally it starts to stick. And the other thing then that I think is really important is some sort of a visual for them to really understand what these techniques are. Once I kind of feel like they have a good understanding of that, then I kind of move on to, similar kind of activities like I've explained already, the matching exercises, filling in the blanks, highlight the examples, pick out the non-example. And I have a lot of that kind of work in Touchstones one as well. So for me, I think writing to analyze, it's always the hardest thing to teach. And it's one of the key exam skills they need to master for junior cycle English. You know, I've tried all of the different PQEs, PE, PEL, whatever else you're having. And my main issue really, especially in first year English, is that they don't really get it. They don't have the skill set yet to be able to kind of put that type of paragraph together. So I think they're already a bit overloaded with poetry. It's not a genre they're overly familiar with. They're trying to learn all these new techniques. So by the end of first year, what I really want is them to be able to write a very short paragraph on a poem. Maybe identify a theme, identify an idea, maybe identify some language techniques, maybe try and use some critical vocabulary in it, maybe try and embed a quotation in there. But I'm not putting in any strict system yet in first year until all of that other kind of those foundation blocks are in first. So I do love a good structure, and especially when teaching poetry, because, like I said, it's just so hard. I try to manage the load on them. So I divide my first year poetry into four sections, which are the same sections that I've laid out in the book, and I move through them in sequence. So in section one, I'm focusing on how a poet builds a poem, the structure, the speaker, the rhythm, the rhyme. And then I will use one of those poems as a studied poem to solidify that new learning. And then I'll move on to section two, looking at theme, subject, mood, and tone. And I'll pick one of those poems to solidify those four specific things. And I'll work my way through then section three and section four like that in sequence. So that's how I approach it. So I'm just going to take a look there now as well at, specifically teaching a studied poem in first year English. And look, I know that, look, English teachers on a full 22-hour timetable, like we're under pressure. Our job seems to be getting harder and harder. We're all in pre-correcting season at the moment. So when I was putting together version two of Touchstones, I really wanted to help. Um, so for all of the studied poems in the book, we aim to kind of provide every possible thing that you might need to teach that poem in a mixed ability class. So for each of the 12 poems that are in the book, we've got all the usual stuff that's in the textbook and the activity book. We've got the literacy boost pack for each of those poems. And we've also done a little bit more then where we've, done a full PowerPoint for each of the poems. And I'm going to do a walkthrough of that there now. And I've used base details as my example for that. So I divide my study of a poem into three sections. The stuff I'll do before reading it, how I'll get through the kind of base reading of it, and then all of the after reading things that I'm going to do. So I love a good solid structure. I use a solid structure for every text that I use in the classroom, and I really feel it makes a solid, scaffolded, step-by-step approach. And my hope there really is that no one kind of gets left behind by doing that. So I'll start each PowerPoint for all the poems with a retrieval practice exercise. I've basically built the learning skills into each one of the PowerPoints. So this type of activity, at the start of a poem, it helps to kind of the brain to retrieve anything that's in the long-term memory, but it also helps us as teachers and them as students kind of to know what they do know going into the poem and what they don't know going into the poem. So I've tailored all of the retrieval practice exercises to the techniques that are in those individual poems. So if you're following the sequence of the book, the techniques are pre-taught before you start into that section of poems. So it should all kind of make sense. So I've also kind of in these PowerPoints provided the answers on the next slide for the retrieval practice starters. So, you can ask them to retrieve from memory everything that they know, and then you can click onto the next slide to show them the answer so that they can self-correct from that. I don't know why this has disappeared. Oh, here it is. Okay. So for all of the reading tasks, what I've done is done up the answers on the following slide. So if you wanted to just quickly correct the homework from last night, you could throw that up on the screen and they could swap copies and correct that. So that kind of, I suppose, trying to help out. So we've also included visual annotated answers for all of the questions in the textbook to try and help teachers give, solid feedback after kids have done a task. So there's another kind of example of that there. And here again, should be quite visual for them. And what we've also done is we've added some kind of additional scaffolding to the questions that are in the book onto the slides. So this is going to help students who might kind of struggle with coming up with a kind of high level vocab answers or coming up with ideas for answers. So there's an example there. And, you've got a model answer then next to the scaffold. And here's another example, but I think you get the idea here, I think. You have your question and your answers. Again, highly visual and really easy to use. And so each poem then has a kind of an attached writing task. So you're using the poem as a writing stimulus. And what I've done here is done up a model annotated answer for each of those. And additionally, then as well, you might kind of want to, we've included assessment questions at the end with model answers. You might want to use them as a quick assessment at the end of doing the poem. And then you might want to give instant feedback to them with the model answer and get them to kind of compare their answer with the model answer up on the screen. And there's a second question there now. I've tried to do two for each poem. And what I've also included for each poem is a revision task or a kind of a learning the poem task at the end of each PowerPoint to help teachers help their students to actually learn the quotes from the poems or the themes and the ideas from the poems. Because students often really struggle kind of with that kind of, how do I learn this? I suppose. So they also kind of struggle with how to actually make things like flashcards properly and effectively. So I've included instructions as well and examples on how to do it. So you've got all that going on, but you also kind of have, I'll just do a quick run through there of, the literacy boost version of base details. So it'll be running alongside the main kind of version of the text. So you've got your simplified version or your summary kind of version, and you've got your suitable reading comprehension questions then similar to the ones that you've seen in the fiction slides. So you've got your multiple choice, you've got your reading comprehension questions with sentence starters. And then for the writing task, you've got like a heavily, heavily scaffolded version of the writing task that's in the main textbook. And, potentially all of your students could benefit from the scaffolding in that as well. So that is my run through of teaching poetry. And I have made it to the end in record time. So if anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer them, or maybe not. So.
Just double checking the questions here. We have a question here from Mary asking, does the revised book have a reading function on the ebook? Now, I'm not sure if this is like if she means it's like the read aloud or something else. But if it's the read aloud, then yes. Okay, another question that we have here is a Touchstones edition published in 2022. Yes, so this is the second edition. So we have a new edition coming out this year. So the one that you have right now that was published in 2022 was the older version. So that was the first edition. So the second edition that Claire has just showed you all in the presentation is actually the second edition.
I should have mentioned that at the start.
Yes.
Sorry.
So
Whoops.
that's okay. Claire, there's a question there for you. Hi, Claire. You stated that this was the last year you would have the mixed classes. How are you hoping to change that going forward? Class size of 30 here.
Well, it was the third years that I took through last year were the last year that we didn't do those literacy boost classes. So my current third years and my current second years, we have literacy boost classes for them. We do have mixed ability for all first year groups. But I think going forward we are going to continue with having that class of, having those 30 kids helped with the literacy boost program.
Okay. Uh, I have another question here. Do you ask the weaker students to specifically complete the boost section for the questions and ignore the other questions?
Yeah, it really is dependent. So I'm thinking now in my current first year class, there's about four of them who are really, really struggling, and they are really happy to just do the literacy boost version of the activities. There's another two who will kind of maybe start with the literacy boost activities, and sometimes, they finish those quickly and they want to try maybe some of the other questions. Um, it really depends on the kid, but I think what you're doing here is you're giving them options, and you're giving them choice.
Okay. I have another question here. Did other subject areas adopt your approach, i.e., flashcards, etc.? Have you found there's some buying school-wide? There is
Yeah,
some buying school-wide. Sorry, that was, yeah.
yeah. So I wrote a junior cycle short course about maybe 7 or 8 years ago when that well-being program was coming in. It's called My Brain and Me. So all of our students do My Brain and Me in first year and second year. And basically, the purpose of the course is to teach them how to make flashcards, make sketch notes, do graphic organizers, do Cornell notes. So you teach them all those skills, and you know, you're teaching them about how their brain learns, retrieval practice, all of that kind of stuff. So, like, we've been lucky in that regard that all of the kids have the skills, and I did a lot of teacher training in the school about that as well. Um, I think we're in year six or year seven of it now. So I've been lucky with that.
Okay. I have another question here asking, is there an equivalent textbook for second and third year? So, yes, there is. Well, it's coming next year.
Yeah.
Be available next year.
Yeah. So I suppose the approach I'm going to take with the revised version of Touchstones 2 is going to be very similar, with a very similar focus on mixed ability teaching in the English classroom.
Okay. Someone says, thanks, Claire. The book looks amazing. Does the literacy boost version include in the book? included in the book, or is that an add-on where you give sheets to the students who would need it?
No, so how it works is you have the textbook and you have the activity book. So within the activity book, at the end of each chapter, so at the end of the fiction chapter, there's the literacy boost chapter. So it's quite subtle in that you could have, you know, a kid working away on the literacy boost section, and the other kids won't know that they're working on the literacy boost section because they're working from the same textbook and same activity book. They're just on a different page of it. I don't know, does that make sense? I think it does.
Okay. Another question here. I'm completely behind the idea of the literacy boost as it builds the confidence of the less confident readers, but how does this sit with the current recommendations for mixability from inspections? I feel it's being pushed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we had a WSE MML there, or whatever you call it, at the end of last year, and they came into both of my literacy boost classes. And they were extremely positive about it in their report, and extremely, complimentary of it. So, it still is like the literacy boost class is still a mixed ability class. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah, they were highly complimentary of it. It was just literally last May, so I think it should be fine.
Okay. Another question here. Is my brain and me available for use, please?
I'm busy getting this one out now first. I have to
Because
do a
there's
job
another, somebody also asked, can we access your JC short course, My Brain and Me?
as well. Yeah, yeah, busy with a full-time job and trying to get this book out first. So, we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, another question. Will the revised version change a scheme of work?
Um, I would say the biggest changes to the schemes of work were in the fiction section. I would say that I have revamped the fiction section in terms of I've a lot of small short stories in there as opposed to two very long short stories. But a lot of it has, I suppose, like the planning would be very similar. So I suppose if you have a scheme of work or a plan for your department, um, it's it's basically the same approach, just with, I feel, better resources and more resources.
Okay. I have one last question here. Is the revised version a lot different to the first edition? Thanks, Claire. You're amazing. Sorry, that's not actually the last question. There's another question after that one.
I suppose, like, I only obviously have 40 minutes there to kind of run through, and I was only able to kind of run through what I thought was the um, most important change in it, or the most important addition to it. I've only really had time to go through, you know, the literacy boost changes to it. And the easiest thing really, I suppose, would be to get a version of it off the reps once it's available, and take a look through, um, would be my
Yeah.
advice. Yeah.
Yes, actually, just to add to that, you feel free to email your sales reps via edco.ie, and I'll send an email as well after this anyway, just to give you a copy of this, a copy of the webinar so you can watch it, and then any other details for how to contact your rep. This question here we have from Mary asking, any insight on why English at higher level JC got the least number of distinctions across all subjects in the junior cycle?
I think at that's always been the curve in English. Isn't it the same at Leaving Cert? We get the least H1s. I'm taking it as a compliment that we're actually the best, most efficient markers. But it's always been the way. I mean, in our classes, like we've 7 classes in each year group, and you'd be lucky to have one in each class, one distinction in each class, and that's been the way since junior cycle English was changed. Um, but yeah, you're looking then at a group of kids in another subject, and I don't know, they've seven distinctions, and you're there with your one or maybe none, and it doesn't feel great. I hear you.
Yeah. Okay, no, this one is for me to answer, Claire. So somebody asked, we don't have a rep, unfortunately, but hopefully EDCO will send the books directly to the schools without a rep. Yes, for those of you who don't have an EDCO representative, you can email us directly at info@edcolearning.ie or sales@edcolearning.ie. But we will send out information anyway on how to request samples once they're available, and then organize that for you, no problem. And I think there's one here, but I'm not sure if it's a question. I don't think it is a question, Claire. It's just a
Okay.
comment. Clearly, we want more books, no bad thing. A book for the literacy boost course would be fantastic.
Yeah.
So there's one for you, Claire.
I'll get to it.
I think that's the all of the questions answered. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to email us at info@edcolearning.ie. I put in the chat box on how to request your certificate of attendance, so feel free to email me directly to request your certificate of attendance. And thank you, Claire, for hosting this evening's webinar, and thank you everyone for your time. And please await my email with a copy of this webinar. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.